Tipping has become a burden. 25, 50, 75% tips for a takeout order or Starbucks coffee. And don't even get me started on food delivery apps. If you're ordering something small, be prepared to leave a tip that's worth more than your order itself. And it's not just restaurants where you'll be tipping either. Nowadays, tipping is commonplace at barbershops, car washes, Ubers, plumbers, and basically any other service that you can think of, which doesn't really make sense. At least with restaurants, the service is not the main thing you're paying for. You're paying for the food, so it kind of makes sense to appreciate great service that came along with it. But in the case of a car wash or a haircut, you're paying for the service itself, so it's kind of odd that you have to pay 15 or 25% more. And inflation has only made this worse. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that these people shouldn't be paid a fair wage, but rather that it should be reflected in the upfront price. This would not only make it easier for customers to gauge just how much they're spending for a service, but it also makes the income of the service worker much more stable. In fact, this is how it's done in most places outside of the United States and Canada. In countries like France, Denmark, and much of Europe, a standard service fee of 15% is applied to all bills. So there's no awkward situation where you have to select 15, 25, 35%, or no tip as the cashiers watch you. But even this is not ideal. Ideally, the price of the service is just included in the product itself, as is the case in Japan, China, and South Korea. In fact, in many of these countries, tipping is actually considered rude and disrespectful. The reason being that if you're tipping, you're basically insinuating that the business does not pay them enough, which is unfortunately often the case in America. In fact, the minimum wage for service workers is only $2.13 per hour in America. But how did things get so bad? How did tipping go from being something that we used to appreciate exceptional service to being a burden for customers and a necessity for employees? Taking a look back, tipping wasn't always a custom in the United States, but it has been this way for quite some time, as American tipping dates back to the mid-1800s. You may have heard that tip stands for to ensure promptness, but that's just a myth. In reality, tipping was something that wealthy Americans discovered when traveling to Europe. You see, tipping was a master-serf custom that was invented in Europe during the Middle Ages. Masters would reward servants with extra cash for excellent service. As these Americans saw this practice, they latched onto it and they brought it back to the US. Being able to pay extra for a service really showcased their status and wealth, which many of their egos could not resist. But tipping didn't catch on in America that easily. In fact, there was a lot of resistance to tipping. For one, people felt that tipping culture was simply reinforcing social constructs and classism. The upper class was literally flexing their wealth on lower class citizens. But that wasn't the only concern. The other concern was that tipping was only viable for the rich. Eating out was expensive as it is, so expecting middle class and lower class people to offer tips on top of the bill seemed un-American. Fun fact, this ideology became so prevalent in America that it actually spread to Europe, and that's why tipping is not standard in European countries. But America would completely U-turn on this idea after the Civil War. While slaves were finally freed, their job prospects weren't all that great, and most of them would end up in service-related industries. And these industries figured that this was the perfect opportunity to capitalize on tipping. You see, these industries figured that they could get away with paying former slaves no money. Technically, they weren't enslaving these people as they could earn money through tips. Also, they could theoretically leave at any time, but really, it's not like they had anywhere else to go to. So, service industries became filled with former slaves that became dependent on tips for income. Suddenly, tipping was no longer a way to flex your wealth. It became much more of a moral issue. If you didn't tip, you were inadvertently supporting slavery. Now, of course, you could argue that if you buy chocolate or something, you're supporting child labor in some third world country. But it's much harder to accept that when you're face to face with a person. Essentially, people who were against slavery started feeling obliged to tip, regardless of their own financial position, and with that, tipping started becoming a burden. While tipping was rapidly gaining popularity throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, this isn't to say that everyone was happy with the practice. In fact, a large portion of the population was not happy with the practice, and we would see some resistance even from local governments. Georgia, for example, deemed that tips were essentially commercial bribes used to influence service. So naturally, paying bribes should not be customary or encouraged. But the issue was that much of the pushback from these governments were classic in their own ways. For example, in 1915, 6 states would abolish the practice of tipping. This seems like a reasonable move. The policy that should have been introduced to enforce this rule would have been some sort of minimum wage. This way, service workers would no longer be dependent on tips. But instead of punishing businesses for paying $0 incomes, these governments would decide to punish service workers. Iowa, for example, ruled that those who accepted a gratuity of any kind, not those who gave the money themselves, could be fined or imprisoned. Fortunately, Supreme Courts would step in and deem these rules unconstitutional, but they never proposed a better solution, meaning that things just returned to how they were. In fact, they actually became worse due to a series of laws passed by Congress, starting with the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. This legislation introduced a federal minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, and banned child labor, which sounds great. But the pitfall of this act was that it specifically excluded tipped workers. Congress would simply double down on this stance in 1966 with their so-called tip credit. Essentially, restaurants were legally allowed to pay a sub-minimum wage as long as tips pushed workers over the minimum wage threshold. At least restaurants were required to pay a percentage of the minimum wage, usually somewhere between 40 and 60%. But this too would change with time. In 1996, Congress ruled that restaurants only had to pay tipped workers a minimum of $2.13 per hour, and that's still how it is across much of the US. You would think that with all these anti-service worker policies that people would rise up and protest these changes, but the exact opposite actually happened. You see, the demographics of service industries were rapidly changing. It was no longer a bunch of former slaves. In fact, over 50% of all waiters are now white people. But it wasn't just the public that was okay with the tipping either. Many service workers actually preferred the tipping model. You see, it wasn't just the race of service workers that was changing, it was also the age. Nowadays, service industries are filled with a bunch of high school students and young adults. In fact, nearly 50% of all waiters are between the age of 20 and 30. For these people, doing service work is often a part-time thing, so stability isn't necessarily the top concern, meaning that they're much more willing to take a gamble. Instead of taking a set minimum wage, they're willing to bet on the generosity of people during a Friday night or Independence Day weekend. Statistically speaking, you're much better off with a minimum wage, but this hasn't exactly changed the minds of service workers. Tipping was no longer about appreciation or fighting slavery. Tipping was now about maximizing revenue for service industries and service workers, leading us to where we are today. It turns out that there's a whole science behind the psychology of tipping, and there's dozens of research articles about how to maximize tips. These studies found that waiters should introduce themselves, repeat customer orders, give compliments, call customers by their name, etc. But those are all small fish items. The factor that has really propagated modern tipping culture is none other than technology. The reality is that technology makes it so easy to spend money and has removed so much of the pain that is naturally associated with spending money that we're simply way more willing to spend money. Take cards, for example. Consumers are willing to spend up to 83% more when paying with a card as opposed to cash. So I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that the average cash purchase is only $22 while the average card purchase is $112. But by far the biggest culprit when it comes to excessive tipping is the infamous iPad payment terminals. For starters, you're paying with a card as opposed to cash, so that's already working against you. But there are several other factors that push you to tip. For example, you don't have to go through the hassle of calculating a tip. You can simply select a percentage and the iPad will do the math. Another technique that these terminals employ is suggesting a super high minimum tip. This terminal, for example, is suggesting a minimum tip of 18%. Of course, you could skip the tip, But what if you felt that the service actually deserved a 5 or 10% tip? You can either type in the tip manually, which would just prolong the awkwardness, or you can just select 18. Speaking of awkwardness, this is likely the most effective method when it comes to guilting customers into tipping and the source of most people's frustrations. Traditionally, any and all tips are left on the table and waiters don't see the amount until after the customer leaves. This allows customers to be honest about how good the service actually was. But when you're forced to select a tip amount at the register, you know that the cashier is going to see what you select, but that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that everyone behind you is also going to see what you select, and you don't want to be that one person that skips the tip. Service industries have figured out how to brilliantly leverage technology and peer pressure you into maximizing tips. While this is a smart move for them, this has simply left customers exhausted and frustrated with modern tipping. Hearing all this, I don't think that you'd be surprised to hear that there's a strong and a growing movement against tipping. These people argue that tipping has nothing to do with showing appreciation and everything to do with the fact that many service workers aren't paid fairly to begin with. I mean, it's not like you tip service workers who are paid well. For example, when was the last time you tipped your pilot or your lawyer or your accountant or your doctor? These people provide way more valuable services than a waiter or a hotel housekeeper, yet you don't tip them. If anything, you might send them a thank you note or buy them chocolate. Why? Well, probably because you know that they're already paid well, which supports the idea that the only reason you tip some service workers is because you know they're paid poorly, not actually because you appreciate their service. So theoretically, if we paid service workers better wages, we can eliminate tipping culture in America. Pro-tippers don't agree. They feel that eliminating tipping will simply give businesses more opportunity to gouge prices. For example, a $21 meal may rise to $24. Also, this isn't all that favorable for takeout customers as they will also have to pay the higher prices. But with that being said, it looks like the rest of the world has made this work, so maybe there's something to it. But only time will tell. Are you team anti-tip or team pro-tip? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you think tipping has gone way too far. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.